As I said, for instance, if you have Crossan, who was here, you'll be able to figure out that he draws heavily on two things, and that's Luke, and he draws heavily on the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Peter. And this is what's called the third wave. I'll start the class in a few minutes, but just to let you know, there have been three groups of searches for who Jesus is, historical searches, to try to figure out, we have four different pictures of who he is in the Gospel. So what was he really like? What was he really like? And so there was a search in the 19th, early 20th, and then shortly after the World War II, and then in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And at that time, there were issues that came up that people started correcting earlier beliefs. And the things that they were interested in were, one, the non-canonical Gospels. And they were trying to figure out, do those help us understand who Jesus was? And we're going to end the class today with this. But in the 19th and 20th century, and up until the 1960s, there was a big focus on Jesus as non-Jew. And in the 19th century, there's some writers, and it actually goes up into Nazi Germany, and it's not just Nazi Germany, but German scholars who lead scholarship on the Bible around the world used to teach that, that Jesus was born in Galilee, and Galilee's non-Jewish territory, and so he was not Jewish. But in the 70s, several scholars started reading Jewish material that's not in the Bible, and started realizing that Jesus was very much like them. And so there's this rediscovery of Jesus as Jew. And Matthew becomes really, really important since the 70s. A guy named E.P. Sanders is probably the leader in doing that. You'll see him on here. He borrows the ideas of Albert Schweitzer, and I'll talk about him later on, and adds this Jewish component to it. But there were four criteria that they had for deciding who Jesus was, and they would run all of the Gospels and stuff through it. But in the last 10 years, there's been criticism of those criteria. And so there's sort of been a break. The only major work on Jesus in recent years have been on the page 3. You see Reza Aslan. Remember, like 10 years ago, his book called Zealot, here you go, called Zealot, became very popular because he was arguing that Jesus was not this peaceful guy. He was out there wanting to overthrow the Roman Empire. And that's actually, as I point out here, probably the second guy in the first search for Jesus, Herman Reimarus, had the exact same idea. So it's not a new idea, even though Reza Aslan said, no one has ever had this idea before. Well, other people have had the idea before. But you'll see dramatically different pictures of who Jesus is in here. Just so you know, I'll run through. Marcus Borg died. He was Lutheran and became Episcopalian. John Dominic Crossan was a priest, and he's Catholic but not a priest. He's 100 years old, and he's got a Lenten series that you can pay to watch online. He's still kicking and teaching. Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza is a leading feminist scholar on Jesus in the New Testament. Paula Fredrickson was Catholic but converted to Judaism during her studies of Jesus. Richard Horsley is a major figure. You want this?
Oh, sure. I'll grab it.
He's very interested in the social context of who Jesus is. He wrote a book called The Spiral of Violence, was very important. John Meyer is a major Catholic figure, and his book, A Marginal Jew, is a controversial but interesting book. E.P. Sanders, I've talked about a lot. He's a Methodist. He passed away a few years ago. Geza Vermesh. He was the leading scholar on the Dead Sea Scrolls. He was, after the first group went in, there was a lot of controversy and stuff. They sent Geza in to fix it up. But he also, as I told you, realized he was Jewish after 45 years into his study, and his family had converted from Judaism to Catholicism during World War II. Ben Witherington is an evangelical scholar, and N.T. Wright is a bishop in England who's politically very, he's a socialist, but religiously he's conservative. In fact, I asked Paula Fredrickson, the Jesus scholars, do you dislike the most? And she told me Tom Wright. So you can see, man, these people don't all agree on stuff. But let's review. And so I'm going to get back to this. And again, I want you, by the end of this class, to be able to say, okay, I'm looking at, as I said, Fiorenza, which gospel is she drawing on the most? I want you to have some idea of what each of these gospels say and how Jesus appears in each. And maybe even to start thinking about which, this is the one I'm most interested in. This is the one that doesn't sound right to me. So here's our review of Jesus and Mark. And he's named the Son of God at baptism. Okay, remember this is different from Matthew and Luke, where he's named the Son of God at birth, and at John, where he's named the Son of God before he's even born. So that starts with this baptism, and that's the most important thing. He displayed the power of God in healings and exorcism. So God is working through him, and people talk about Christologies, how high or low, how divine. Someone asks, of the four Gospels, this is the lowest one, but he has God working through him while he's doing healings and exorcisms. He's also telling parables. He's not a teacher like he is in some of the other Gospels. He's misunderstood by everybody around him. His family doesn't understand him. Here's a couple more of these for people who just come in. So just hang on to those. Those are for you. And as I said, I'll bring them back up. And everybody around him misunderstands him. And when he tells them to stay quiet about who he is, he's enigmatic, secretive, and prone to human emotions. And we'll talk about this in a minute. Matthew is not the same way on this. But it's funny, he tells everybody around him when he does some sort of miracle or something, don't tell anybody else about it, okay? And what happens? They all do. But except at the very end of the gospel, the guy on top of the tomb, it's a guy in a white outfit, robe. It doesn't say an angel, but other gospels interpret it as an angel. And then he says, go and tell the disciples that he's risen. And what do? They're told to go tell people, and then they don't. So that's the ironic end to the whole thing. Next, he's apocalyptic. He teaches repeatedly that the end time is coming soon, and maybe even in his own lifetime. And John is not like that. We'll see he's not like that. He spoke in parables like the prophets of old, and he's a reluctant Messiah. He knows he's the Messiah, but this is a burden on him. He even to the very end, he asks, can this cup pass over me? And to the very end, he feels like God has abandoned him, quoting a verse from the Psalms. And then I told you the way to think about how these Gospels, these three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, how they're tied together. And this is the thing to remember. So Mark writes first, and then Matthew and Luke use Mark, and then there's this other document that I'm going to talk about next time called Q, which is the common stuff between Luke and Matthew. They both have some document that they're both using, and sometimes quote it verbatim, and then sometimes quote it a little bit differently. And I told you one of the Beatitudes in Luke, it talks about those who hunger and thirst, and then Matthew has the same thing from Q, those who hunger and thirst, and then he adds for righteousness. So it removes the money element that you have in Luke. And Luke's very concerned about social issues to a degree that none of the other four is. So we'll talk about Q later. These two also probably have another document. But what I want you to think about on this is Matthew, and it's not really, as I told you last time, it's anonymous. We don't know who the author is actually sitting down and editing these texts. He's going through and editing the different documents. And they had an attitude toward these other texts that we don't have. We think of them as being untouchable, and some people say inerrant and things like that. But we found out in the Dead Sea Scrolls that some of the authors of the different texts, like Isaiah, would make changes. If they would say, well, that doesn't make sense, but it should say this. And so there would be changes among the different texts. So the Dead Sea Scrolls ended up being an older version of the Old Testament. And the Jewish community used a thing called the Masoretic text from about the year 1000. This is 1,000 years older. But that's what I want you to think about. Matthew sitting here looking at Mark and editing it. I'm going to show you 3 things that are really cool about how he edited. So these are in general his edits. This is Matthew. I don't think he looked anything like that, but I thought it was a cool picture. So I call it the Gospel of Mark 2.0. Okay? He didn't like that there was no beginning and end, no birth, or it ends before the answer. He has a nativity, he has a genealogy, and he has a resurrection to the thing. Now he uses 90% of what's in Mark. Okay? His is longer. His is 18,000 words. Mark is 11,000 words. And he uses 90% of it, but he scrambles it up. He changes parts of it, and he adds a beginning and an end. He removes errors and emotions. I'm going to get back to the emotions. He doesn't like the fact that Jesus gets angry at a certain point, that he shows pity on somebody. And he doesn't even like the fact that when the rich young ruler comes to him and says, how do I get into the kingdom of God? Jesus says that he felt love for him, and then answered. Matthew just took out he felt love for him and just says he answered. So he wanted to emphasize that it was a higher Christology, that he's more divine. He's not up in he's not the second figure in the Trinity yet. That comes with time, but that's not there yet. 2, he reorganizes it into Moses-like structure. And I told you last time we talked, he's added parts of the nativity scene that's very much like Moses goes to Egypt and all of that. He has a genealogy that ties Jesus back to David, even though the genealogy is through his father, and it's a virgin birth, so he's not really his father. So I don't know how the whole thing connects together. But then there's also the book is organized in 5 sections, just like the Torah and just like the Psalms. The Psalms are in 5 books. And so he wants to say, he creates a structure that's would be very comfortable for Jewish people. So there's 2 things going on. He has an image of who Jesus was as a Jew, and then he has a structure of the text that likens it to Moses. He also uses a more polished Greek. And this is, if you were able to read Greek, it would probably, I mean, it's easy to sit down and read it in an hour and a half or so. But if you had it in the original Greek, or your translation, there's one translation that's very loyal to the text, and it reads like this: and Jesus went and did this, and then Jesus went and did that, and then Jesus did this other thing, and everything's in the present tense. And Jesus does this, Jesus got in trouble, and then Jesus does this. It's all very much the same structure. Probably somebody who wasn't great at Greek, but still was good enough to write a text like this. But the organization is really sophisticated. And I haven't talked to you about this before, but I want to tell you once at a point, he has this idea to help you understand some of the difficult stories there. He does a thing called sandwiching, and he'll put the difficult passage in between 2 other passages, and those 2 passages help you understand the difficult passage. So the book and the organization's sophisticated, even though the Greek is not. The Greek is still better than, say, Revelation, which is really bad. But this is more polished. It's not as good as Luke. Luke is the high point of in terms of being able to write in the New Testament. Also, the disciples who have no faith throughout Mark never have faith the whole time. It's changed to little faith. And you think that's not a big significant thing? Well, the story of the mustard seed is about what?
Little.
People with little faith who are able to accomplish a lot. So he's sort of rehabilitating them. Still realizes there's problems, but he's rehabilitating who they are. So, and Peter's front and center in the book. He's mentioned a lot in Mark, but he is the guy in here and runs into some problems. A couple other things. Prophecies are really, really important here, much more important than any place else. Family is also rehabilitated. You might remember in Mark 3, Jesus, the family comes and they say they have to get him from Capernaum because they think he might be crazy. There's none of that in here. They're rehabilitated, and they become much more important throughout the text. And then doubt's an important factor throughout the book, and it actually ends after the resurrection when Jesus meets the disciples, has an appearance, and talks to them. It's an amazing verse. It's 28, I think 19, where it said they believed in him. Most of them believed in him, yet others still doubted, which is crazy for us when we're thinking about, well, I have problems with some of the things of my faith. Well, here are the disciples with him after his resurrection, and yet they still doubt. So that's sort of an interesting idea that they have in there, and it's probably a reflection of what was going on in Matthew's community. So here's some of the edits that I wanted to tell you about. This is a passage in Mark, and it says, Jesus said to them, prophets are, he goes to Nazareth, okay? And things don't go well when he goes back to Nazareth. Things don't go well when he's around his family. And it says to them that he could do no deed of power there except he laid his hands on a few people and cured them. But for the most part, he didn't have the power to do anything in Nazareth. And that the people there also rejected him. But that's the second point, that he was amazed at their unbelief.
That's Mark.
What's that? This is Mark. And so also notice among his own kin, he's even rejected here. I told you he's rehabilitated elsewhere. But here, even his mom and his brothers, we don't hear about Joseph ever in Mark. He's not discussed, not named or anything. But his brothers, and remember, James becomes the leader of the movement once Jesus died. But here, even his family still rejected him. Well, Matthew doesn't like that. So he drops out among his own kin. Okay, and he takes his safe bets. And then he doesn't like that he can't do stuff on his own. So he says that he could do nothing because of their unbelief. So it's not a problem with him, it's a problem with their unbelief. And that's the issue. Okay? And then here's another one. And this one, people are like, how do you know what the community was like that Jesus was talking to? And this is a good example of that. Here's this passage where the Pharisees get upset that Jesus' disciples are not washing their hands before they eat. And in Mark is writing for a Gentile community, and they don't understand the Jewish rules. So he has to have this parenthetical section in here explaining what the Jewish laws were. Okay? Matthew didn't need to do that. His community was Jewish and did these things, so he just leaves it out. There's another similar situation with where Mark says at one point that Jesus declared all foods clean. This community would probably not agree with that, and you won't find that verse anywhere in Matthew. So he's adopting and changing things for his Jewish community. Well, here's another one. This is one I love, and I learned about this a couple years ago, and I like reading the text and finding these things. It's called editorial fatigue. A guy in the 80s did it, and then I took a class with a guy named Mark Goodacre, and he just loves doing this. And that is when you're taking the story and he realizes that Mark has made an error. They're all minor errors, but usually historical errors. Sometimes biblical quotes where he actually mushes a couple verses together and then he'll pull them apart and say these are the verses. But in this case, this is Mark, this is Matthew. Matthew 15, Mark 4. And it starts off, King Herod heard of it and he learned who Jesus was. His name was getting around. And then you come to the passage where he orders John the Baptist beheaded. Okay? So this is Matthew over here. Matthew realizes King Herod died when Jesus was about 1 year old. Okay? So King Herod wasn't around. There was no King Herod. So he changes it to, it was Herod's son, Antipas, and changes it to the Tetrarch. Okay? So he fixes the passage and says, okay, this is the way it should be. But then he forgets about his edit and gets down in the story, and then he accidentally says king himself. So sometimes you have to catch up, and Luke does this in one instance on the story about the seeds, where they throw out the seeds, and it's on good ground, bad ground. Well, he doesn't like one of those, so he takes out the story, says there are only three things that he tosses seeds among. in step 4, but he leaves the 4 interpretations in. So there's this one seed thing that doesn't match, but he's making the edit for some change, but then we didn't have computers and all that sort of stuff. You're looking at actually scrolls and multiple scrolls and trying to write his stuff or dictating it probably to a slave or something. And so he ends up, he even catches the second one, the he and king there. Mark's got a king throughout, but he ends up making that little, he gets caught on that little thing as well. So the question is, when Matthew's making all of these changes, what was his intention? Did he intend to supplement and improve Mark, or do you think he tried to replace him and encourage people to use his text? Is it a replacement, or is it something to supplement? Anybody have any thoughts or ideas? What would he be doing at this time? And at that time, there's no Bible. Paul's writings are out there, but they're not scripture yet. So he's trying to figure out, it's just an interesting thing. He's going through and he's making these changes, and then Luke goes through and makes changes as well. And Luke actually says there are a lot of other writings about Jesus out there, but I'm doing the right version. He thinks he's replacing what they're doing, and his should be the definitive edition. But here, what are we dealing with? Okay? Anybody have any thoughts? Go ahead.
I think that the audience that Mark spoke to and Matthew spoke to were different.
Right.
And it's all diaspora.
Right.
Everything is written after the total destruction. And so I think Matthew was, you begin in the second generation asking the questions. The first generation isn't too much concerned about where the parents came from.
I think, you should be teaching the class. I think what's going on is he reads Mark and he thinks it's wholly inadequate for his community.
Exactly.
And so he edits it to make it fit and work for his community. He also thinks, I know Jesus is fundamentally a Jew. That was written for a Gentile audience. See, he had to leave out stuff here, so I'm going to put some of that stuff back in.
Right.
And so that's the issue. So he's writing for, and we'll talk about what was the audience. So here's the background for his audience. Okay, Christianity was, the whole world was pretty diverse. We think our world's diverse now, but it's pretty diverse then. In the early church, you had people who believed there was one God. You had people who believed there were two gods. You had people who believed there were 12 gods. You even had one group who believed there were 365 gods. And so they're trying to negotiate all this, and he's writing for his community. But who's the community? Well, this is what Rome is like, the Roman Empire. It's also very diverse. Wherever you go, every city has its main god. The issues that were concerned to them are not the issues that we're concerned with, and the reverse is true. The issues that we're concerned about are frequently not discussed, because it would solve a lot of our problems and make elections a whole lot easier if Jesus said, well, just so you know, here's my view on abortion, and just laid it out there, and people wouldn't have to be finding some obscure verse in Psalms that they think fits to it, and the liberals wouldn't have to find a verse in Exodus that they think speaks to their view. It would just be out there. He didn't say what he thought about the death penalty. I'm sure he wasn't for it for himself, but he doesn't. But he doesn't really just lay out there. These are the things that would. It'd be nice if he did, but he's writing 2,000 years ago, and so this is to help you understand what the issues were then and why Matthew is written that way. 2, 3. This is very much you got to think about. Here, we live in an open market. If you don't like what I'm teaching or what the pastor is teaching here, you can go next door, or you can go down the street, or you can go to the next town. It's a marketplace of whatever. You can go wherever you want to. I don't go to the church I grew up in. They probably wouldn't have me, but or you could drop out altogether, which is another option. There, wherever you were born, is the religion that you had, the ethnicity that you had, and the cultic practices that you did. And that's the way it was. Very, very few people changed. That's just the way, and if you were Jewish, even in the diaspora, you grew up in a family, you did these practices, you adapted, but that's the way it worked, okay? And then Judaism is just a fragment of the community. And some people say about 7 to 10%, so a little bit bigger than you might think, but that's how big they are. They have Jerusalem, which is a variety of religions, and more than 1 million people there, but you had people all around the whole Roman Empire. And for the Christians, they start off as ethnically and culturally Jewish, okay? Everybody was. You start off, and that was the milieu that you went into. Okay, so they practice law. They read the Jewish Bible. Jewish Bible's not finished yet. The law, it's 3 sections. There's the law, the prophets, and the writings. There hadn't been a decision about the writings, but you'll frequently hear the law and the prophets. And that's a reference to the sacred text as discussed at that time. And we'll have passages say the law and the prophets, and that is the law and the prophets. And they also met in synagogues. And again, we're frequently finding more and more synagogues. Just 30 years ago, there was only 1 or 2 synagogues that have been discovered. But there's one in Capernaum. The one that exists now is from the 5th century, but several layers lower is that. But this was the difference. They saw Jesus as the Messiah. And so that throws a wrench in things, because there are many Jews that don't accept that. And these Jesus following Jews have this belief, and this is an important thing to know. These early Christians believed that the coming of the Messiah would lead non-Jews, Gentiles, to abandon their gods and worship the one true God. They took passages like this from Isaiah that says, in that day, that's the day of the Messiah, people will cast forth their idols of silver and idols of gold, which they made for them to worship. So if you believe this is going to happen, that now that the Messiah is here, the kingdom of God's going to come as soon as the Gentiles convert, what do?
You try to convert.
Well, if you're Paul, you go and try to convert people. And people don't do that back then, okay? It creates a problem for the people outside of the Jewish belief religion, because you're going in, and that's why people hated Paul everywhere he went. He explains in 1 Corinthians, I had this, I was thrown in jail, I was whipped, I nearly died. Everywhere he went, he was disrupting things by saying, leave that ethnicity and that system that you grew up in and come into our system. In Ephesus, he has the issue where he tells them to do that, and the people who make the idols get really upset because their business starts falling off. So there's a financial incentive to this as well. So it's very disruptive to them, but also for the Jewish people, it's disruptive. If someone is a Gentile and they're converted to Christianity, Jewish Christianity, what beliefs do they have to follow as a Jew? So this breaks down into 2 groups. There are lots more groups, but these are this is what's important to know for our background on Matthew. Okay, should the converts adopt Jewish practices? Okay, there's a group that says, that I call them the law-observant Jewish Christians. They say absolutely, okay? And this is discussed in Acts, and Acts 15 in particular. It says, some believers stood up and said, it is necessary for them, the converts, to be circumcised in order to keep the law of Moses. So they thought, you get the whole package, okay? And then there's the other people, Paul's group, who say the converts should follow only a few Jewish traditions and laws. And you might remember my class that I gave on Paul. I called it Torah Light. He pointed out several verses, several of the commandments, 5 or 6 of them, and said you have to do these still, but you don't have to do the ritual stuff. You don't have to get a circumcision. You don't have to keep kosher. You don't have to do all of that sort of stuff. And so this blows up in the letter to the Galatians, because this is James, the brother of Jesus, holds to this, and Paul, who holds to this, and Peter gets caught between the 2 groups. okay? And so Paul tells what ends up happening, but it's actually not clear if he wins the debate or not. He just explains his side, and he never says, Paul, who loves to brag, doesn't say, and everybody else agreed with me and it was resolved. He just says, this is what I said, and it was clear to everybody, and then that's it. But here, Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and debate with these people. And these groups go on for a while. And in fact, the break, it's called the parting of the ways, when the Christians and the Jews eventually separate. But even John Chrysostom in the 4th century is giving sermons and complaining because there are farmers in his community during a drought are going to synagogue on Saturday and church on Sunday and hoping one or the other will help them get water for their stuff. So, Kevin, I'll give you, anybody else not have one of these? Go ahead, what's your question?
The question is, how much of Paul's letters influenced the writer of Matthew?
I think it's 0. But the better question is, how much did he influence?
But
the
those
author?
letters came way before Matthew was written.
It was, but I think he influenced the author, Mark. And in fact, there's a lot of, I watched an hour-long debate among 5 of the people on your sheet of paper discussing Paul and asking if, what hand Paul had in writing Mark. I don't think he did, but I think the author of Paul, and it's interesting because the tradition that we end up getting is it's Mark who's with Peter, but it's Paul that you see throughout the Gospel of Mark, including the best way to notice the similarities is communion. Paul is the first one to discuss communion in 1 Corinthians, and the version that he tells is almost verbatim the same as in Mark. And so so what I was telling you, this is what you need to know. Scholars believe Mark was written for members of Paul's faction. Maybe not Paul, but people who believed like him. And his side wins out eventually. None of us are Jews in here. It ends up eventually splitting, going the other way. But Matthew was written for the law-observant Christians. And so when you start running into some of these things, that's what you're getting is written for this other group. Another way to say it is Matthew was written during the transition for Christians from Judaism into their own religion. Okay, so we catch them right at the midpoint, and I'm going to show you some things that show how they get caught in the middle, how it gets caught in the middle there. So let's jump into the text. First thing I always do when I talk about Jesus, how do we know Jesus was Jewish? When he lived at his home until he was 30. He went into his father's business. His mother thought he was God. And he thought his mother was a virgin. But the questions we have is, what does the text tell us? What does the text tell us about Jesus? Which is our main concern for this class. So this is Jesus, as I understand him in this text, and then I'm going to focus on the Jewish parts of him. One, he's clearly a rabbi and teacher. He's much more of a teacher than he is in Mark. He loves to talk about everything. To the very end, he's teaching people and telling them his interpretation of the law. Some people say he's telling people to ignore the law. And I'll tell you, it's a thing called building a fence around the Torah, and we'll talk about that in a second. His teaching technique is, he ends up telling people a stricter law, and actually is very much like the Pharisees, telling them oral tradition to avoid breaking the law. Here, you build a fence around it. If you don't break through the fence, then you'll never violate the law. Some people say Eve was doing that in the garden. Some Jewish rabbis say that. He's the Son of God and declared the Son of God at birth. He is full of God's Spirit. And we know this because in Mark, Jesus is never worshipped. The word worship doesn't appear in there. Here, it happens again and again and again. People see him as divine. Okay? People are with, they see him as the Messiah and they see him as divine. In Mark, they think he might be the Messiah, but they're not really sure. And he has some powers and stuff, and the God's working through him, but they're not really sure about that stuff. He's very combative, which is a little bit different from Mark. He takes on the Pharisees again and again, says, you brood of vipers, and a number of things, very harsh. But as we see in a second, that's not usual within the Jewish community at that time. He was a subject of worship, as I said. He's a critic of all authorities. It's not just the Jewish authorities that he's criticizing. He's criticizing Herod. He's criticizing the Romans. He criticizes everybody in authority. Those who will be first will be last in the kingdom of God, and those who are last become first. He sees the world being turned upside down. There's not an authoritative figure outside of God that he has a kind word to say. So some people say he's just attacks the Jews again and again, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but it's actually that he's attacking all the people in authority and finds what they're doing. He thinks they come up short. And he lacks the emotions in Mark. Matthew just goes through and pulls each of these things out in each of the passages they pick. And sometimes the passages are verbatim the same, but he took out pity, anger, sadness, indignation, that was too long, it's going to take me over the line, wonder, and even love. As I said, the one time he doesn't like it when he expresses love for the rich young ruler. But now let's focus on the Jewish part of things. Here's his ministry. He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." And so there's two encounters with Gentiles in the book. One is the Syrophoenician woman, and he's really harsh with her in the text. And he says, I didn't come to help you, came to deal with the Jews. And the other one is the centurion who says, clearly this is the Son of God. He didn't have the interaction, but actually those two people are credited for their faith, while most of the Jews are not credited for their faith. So, but he has very harsh things to say about Gentiles as well.
There's a man who brought his servant to be healed, who was Gentile.
Yeah, that's the centurion.
Centurion, sorry, I mixed up the two, but yeah, and both of them are praised by Jesus for their faith. But it's the Pharisees. I don't think he has. There are references in Luke and Acts that praise the Pharisees frequently.
Yeah, the doulos, or the servant, has no faith.
Right. And then he tells his when he's sending out his disciples, and if you've seen the work The Chosen, it's the complete opposite of this. He tells them to go into Gentile areas to see the Samaritans, do all that stuff. But in Matthew, these 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions: do not take a road leading to Gentiles. Do not enter a Samaritan town, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. As you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Why do you think he calls it the kingdom of heaven? Even though most of them believe the kingdom of heaven is going to be on earth. God comes down and the Messiah will rule, and the 12 disciples will oversee the 12 tribes. Because in the Jewish community, you're not supposed to say the word Yahweh or God. So they say kingdom of heaven throughout. He only once slips and says kingdom of God once, but it's kingdom of heaven in all of the other instances, because he doesn't want to say the word God. So another thing, this is Jewish ritual. Then suddenly a woman who had been suffering from a flow of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. For she was saying to herself, if only I touch his cloak, I will be made well. How many of you have been to Jerusalem? And you've all seen the prayer shawls with the tassels at the bottom? That's what they're talking about. When you imagine Jesus, you need to picture him as wearing a prayer shawl, just like Jewish leaders do today, with the fringes. The fringes are called, I'll butcher the pronunciation, T-Z-I-T, T-Z-I-T, Zitzit. And here they are. Usually blue, sometimes white, sometimes black, but usually blue, and men and women can wear them, as you can see down the corner. And here's what it's based on. Numbers 15:37. The Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and tell them to make fringes on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, to put a blue cord on the fringe of each corner. You have the fringe so that when you see it, you will remember all the commandments of the Lord and do them, and not follow the lust of your heart and of your own eyes. So you will remember and do the commandments, and you shall be holy to your God. So that's, if you ever wondered why do they all have these weird fringes, this is what, so it's a zit that they have on. But that's not the only reference to Jewish practice that we hear. We also hear Jesus talking about the Pharisees, and he tells them, interestingly, that his disciples should follow what the Pharisees are teaching, and you'll get into the kingdom of heaven if you follow what they're teaching, because what they're teaching, what he's teaching, aren't that far apart, okay? It's like, I mean, in terms of the differences, both of them, I like to say, are democratizing some of the elements of the Torah, because for hundreds of years, much of what was said in the Torah was used by the people in the temple, the priests, the scribes. But research by a guy named Jonathan Adler says that you can first find the ritual baths, the mitzvot, and the bowls that are made of stone. You only see them for the first time in Jerusalem in the 3rd century. Before that, they don't exist. You can find actually tons of little idols. You can find these little, like they call them Venus figures, that apparently hundreds of these in the town of Jerusalem, in the city of Jerusalem. But it's only at that time in the 3rd century and during the Hasmonean revolt that people start doing all of the laws and thinking they apply to individuals. And the Pharisees and Jesus are trying to help them understand, how do you interpret these things and apply them to ourselves. I didn't put here, but for example, there's a passage in which Jesus is condemned for doing something on the Sabbath, and he says, what if an animal falls into a well? Should you be able to do that and pull it out? And he says yes. Okay. Well, in the Dead Sea Scrolls community, they have a passage that says, what if a sheep falls into a well on the Sabbath? You should not go near it. So 2 different interpretations of what you should be doing in the Sabbath. How do you interpret that? You're not allowed to burn fire on the Sabbath. So when I was in Jerusalem once, people were stopped because they thought that meant you couldn't open your refrigerator and have the light come on. So most of them put tape on the little thing that sticks out. Or on our elevator, the light always stayed on, and you were not allowed to push the button on the Sabbath because that's turning on a light and starting a fire, so to speak. So but those are called halakhic disputes about what it means and how you apply it to yourself. There's also, we talked about that passage, when they're straining at gnats. So a gnat is an unclean animal. So if a gnat flies into your water and you pour out the water, is the water clean or not? It sounds stupid, but this is the sort of thing that people were debating amongst themselves as to whether, and he says the Pharisees are straining at gnats, they're fighting over this stuff, and then they miss the much larger issues, the camels. So he says they keep their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. So they're the fringes again. And the phylacteries, what are the phylacteries? Does anyone know what the phylacteries are? What's that?
Boxes under there.
Yeah. So and he'll mention also telephin, which are the things wrapped around people's arms, which you also see. And this is Deuteronomy 6. This is one of the passages that's kept inside the phylactery. Keep these words that I'm commanding you to today in your heart. Recite them to your children and talk about them when you are home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And you've seen the things of people's doors where they put things in there. Here's an example. Once again, women, this is a non-binary individual, so anybody can wear them if you're Jewish. It's not just, but again, you would have to imagine when you're thinking about Jesus, thinking that he's actually doing this, he's not doing it in a blatant way, but he's doing these things. He's clearly got the prayer shawl, he's got this, he's wearing phylacteries. That's what a Jew in the 1st century looked like, okay? And now let's talk about the tough thing, the Jewish law, the thing that divides everybody. So the major passage is this. Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. So, okay, that sounds okay, and we can say, it's still there, nothing's happened. It's in the next two verses where things get a little bit difficult if you think you're supposed to follow this passage. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, and you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So that gets a little bit tough. And I'm sure you guys discussed it in your group. Does it apply, not apply to us today? I think Matthew's writing for a community that believes it applied to them at that time. They were Torah observant. They were part of that faction at the top that I told you about, not the Paul group. They're part of the Torah observant group that James appears to be the head of. Okay?
Was that the 517 or whatever?
660. 613. And it's,
So they were referring to all.
he's talking about everything. He's talking about the Torah. You've got to be doing all this stuff. But he has principles for interpreting the Torah. And this is a little bit different. It reminds me a little bit about the debate today that we have between fundamentalists and people who aren't fundamentalists. But with the fundamentalists, if there's a single verse that says one thing, then that trumps everything else. But like during the Civil War, the people who were on the north, many on the north would say, well, the principles are love, grace, faith, and those things, and anything else should be interpreted along those lines. And we're going to see that in just a second in Jesus' interpretation of the law. So look at Luke though, same passage, and Luke adds a phrase in it that we didn't expect and you probably have never seen. The law and the prophets were until John came. He thought things were in operation, and this is from the section called Q. Q is that part that is Matthew and Luke, and this passage is in Q, but one of them says it has under John, the other one says, Jesus said, you keep all of them. So Luke says it all ends with there, and in Q, John the Baptist is really important. Jesus says he's the most important person who's ever lived. Okay? And that's in Luke. And in fact, the Lord's Prayer in Luke, his disciples come to him and say, hey, Jesus, could you teach us that prayer that John's followers are praying? And he says, sure, our Father who art in heaven. It's not the Lord's Prayer, it's actually John's prayer in Luke. And we'll talk about that when we discuss Q next time. So it's interesting. So he says we're no longer required to follow all the laws. It ended with John. Okay? And we'll come back to this when we touch Luke and Luke's understanding of who Jesus is. Have you seen this before? Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing about two different understandings. And again, you start to wonder, so what Luke's audience is, who was his audience there? And then here's Jewish tradition. And this is some of the things that you think were unique to Jesus may not have been. First, I had told you there's this concept called a fence around the Torah. This has been around forever. And this is what's called the oral tradition that the Pharisees did, and people criticize it. And you can hear sermons from people criticizing it, but Jesus does it particularly in Matthew 5. You've heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder. That's the rule. And then he says, how do you avoid this thing? And he says, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you shall be liable to judgment. So he actually builds a wall around that, a fence around it. He says you can't even be angry. And so he does this with what are some of the other ones he does
Adultery.
with adultery. He then draws, you shall not lust. So he draws this fence around it, says you can't get through that. And in fact, what he's teaching is stricter than what the law is saying, and maybe even stricter than what the Pharisees were saying. And that's because he has this idea that in some cases, some laws are so important that we should violate them. We should build a fence around them to keep us from breaking those laws. And actually, the rest of this verse, I never hear people talk about the rest of this thing. You'll be liable to judge. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you shall be liable to the Gehenna later comes to be the idea of hell. And so if you call somebody a fool, you are likely to end up in some sort of hell thing, which I'm going to teach a class on hell sometime soon. That idea is emerging at this point. And then he's using the law to interpret the law, what we were talking about just a second ago. You've heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Okay? Very classic thing we're all taught again and again. But you probably weren't taught that in Proverbs, a very similar idea exists. If your enemies are hungry, give them bread to eat. And if they are thirsty, then give them water to drink. Which sounds a lot like love. Okay? The golden rule, Jesus. So in everything, do to others what you will have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. Okay, law and prophets, I told you, that's basically the what existed of the Bible. It's a few decades more before the writings, they say these are the writings, and so forth. Here's Rabbi Hillel, who dies about 20 years before Jesus dies. What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. All the rest is commentary, go and learn. So, same idea. This is sort of what's in the water at this time. And Jesus and Hillel, who's very much born a Jew, lived a Jew, was part of the ethnic Judaism, that he came to understand that everything else in the Torah is just commentary on this. And if you have a question about what something means in the text, you go back to this idea and how does it fit with that idea. Another one that is important. He said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. So he's quoting the Old Testament here. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Again, so if you have a question about what's in the law or what you should be following, look at these two commandments. And then here's his other one that I wish everybody here knew. This middle section of Matthew 23:23, and that is, he's saying, what is the fundamental part of the law? He says, he's talking to the Pharisees, you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and that is what people were tithing if they didn't have money at that time. So it's exactly aware of the practices. And he goes, you've neglected the weightier matters of law. And this is what he sees the law as being fundamentally: justice and mercy and faith. And so if you have a question about something that's important in the law, and I think you could probably say the same thing about much of what Paul writes. How do we interpret these things? Well, Jesus said we need to focus on the things that are justice, mercy, and faith. And he also gives us the two commandments that we should be following. It's a pretty good principle for understanding many things about our faith, even though this is written for a law-observant community. I mean, this is a pretty powerful section on what we should be believing. But then we have Rabbi Akiva, who lives 100 years after Jesus. Love your neighbor as yourself. This is the major principle of Torah. Again, so he didn't take this from Jesus. This is, again, something that's sort of in the water that people are thinking and believing at that time. And then the Testament of Dan, which is written a little bit later too. Love the Lord with all your life and another person with a sincere heart. Again, it sounds almost like what Jesus is saying in Matthew.
Are you the Dan?
I'm not. In print, I'm Daniel, so be Testament of Daniel. So let's go back to who is Jesus in Matthew. These are three people who attempted to portray a first century Jewish person. And we're going to talk next time about how we lost the Jewish Jesus. But as I told you before, he's a rabbi, he's a son of God, he's combative, he's a subject of worship, he's a critic of all authorities, and he lacks emotions. But he's very much divine in worship throughout what he does. But this is what Matthew's Jesus is like. First, his ministry is focused on the Jewish community. Two, the followers comprised, I say almost, I don't know if there's a couple of exceptions, but exclusively made up of Jews. The message was borrowed and interpreted from the Torah. His disagreements, these halakhic disputes with the Pharisees, are due to similarities. I tend to think of about it as the difference between us and the Chicago Bears. Because we're the closest, we're gonna fight the most. And then Judea was filled with would-be Messiah figures, and I'll talk to you about this at some point. It's a pretty fun thing just on who the other Messiah figures. I think there are 3 mentioned in the New Testament, including one named Jesus. And the guy gets confused. Are you that Jesus? No, not. And then crucifixion was fundamentally a Roman form of execution. Stoning was the Jewish way. But the fact that people think that Jews had a role in his crucifixion, that's just not true. But next time, and we have like 5 minutes still for discussion, we're going to start off with a discussion about given all of this that we're hearing about Jesus and his Jewishness, how did we end up losing Jesus' Jewishness? And when I say that, it's only, I told you, the 3rd wave of the historical Jesus scholarship in the 70s, mainly in the 80s and 90s, really focused on that. Before that, most German scholars, most German Lutheran scholars really downplayed it. Here's one of the leading figures in the search for the historical Jesus in the 1st century. He lived in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Fundamentally, there was nothing Jewish about Jesus. After he visited Jerusalem, he takes John and says he visited there on several occasions. Jesus appears no more as a Jewish reformer, but as a destroyer of Judaism. Jesus was no longer a Jew. And it took time. It starts in the 2nd century when a guy named Marcion says the God of the Old Testament is nothing like Jesus. They're actually 2 different gods. And he ends up putting together the first scripture, and he drops all of the Old Testament. He takes only Luke, he doesn't touch Matthew, and he takes Paul's letters. And he said, this is our Bible. And that's the very first time someone puts together a canon. And as a result of that, the non-Marcion followers said, hey, we got to come up with a canon too. And so it took until the year 365 AD before the church decided on a New Testament that matches ours exactly as it is today. So any questions about this? It's a lot of stuff I threw at you. I love this stuff about reading. I got really excited when I did the thing about the where the author of Matthew slipped up and said king again. I was like, oh, that's great. I've heard about this, but I never it's the fatigue of translating. Go ahead.
I'm curious, you have such a command of those academic literature. Where have you changed after you have studied all this?
Well, I'm not a fundamentalist anymore. But you know what happened is I grew up that way. And then when I went to college, one of my majors was, actually, is anybody here in the Rotary? I just gave this talk at the Rotary in Milwaukee on Tuesday. I grew up, one of my majors, I did history, English, and ancient Greek because I thought I was going to be a pastor. And when you start studying ancient Greek, the first thing that jumps out at you is, 1, it's not always as smooth as everybody's writing that, and then 2, there are variations all over the place, variances. And that started causing me problems because I've been taught that there were no errors in Scripture. And then I started doing more and more reading, and I had a problem with how fair it was. In my church, women weren't allowed to be Sunday school teachers. They weren't allowed to be pastors, but they still ran the church, which was hilarious. They're supposed to be no authority, but they're they were the ones who decided everything. And so that caused me a problem, and then the whole idea that what I believe turned out to be the exact right thing, and everybody else is wrong. So I started having all these things coming together. And then when I went to the University of Chicago, I wasn't there for religion classes, but I don't know, did you see Marty just died?
Yeah.
Just died.
And he came here and talked, Mike, remember, he gave a 4-part series on fundamentalisms across religions. And I had him as a class, and it just started making me change and see that the way people understand the Bible in the academic world is completely different from what is being taught here. And that's when I came here, I said, Sunday school consisted of 4 or 5 people watching a video, and then when the video was done, they would discuss the video. And I told Pastor Gary that I was thinking about coming here, except adult ed was terrible. I then adopted it. He said, well, then you do it better. And so my first class was a 10-part series on archaeology and the Old Testament. I don't think anyone's here for that. Then I did a 10-part series on archaeology and the New Testament. And then I did a historical Jesus thing in the year 1999. So I had to scale back as I got a little bit older, with kids getting older and stuff. But what it's done is make me have a more realistic understanding of what Scripture's like. I learned mainly with a lot of this is reading the Bible horizontally across instead of just vertically. Like many Bible studies are, you sit, you read the whole thing through beginning to end, and at no point do you look and see, oh, how did Mark handle this same thing? How did Luke handle this? How did John handle this? And not just that, but how does what they're saying match up with what's in the archaeological record? Because sometimes, like Jericho, the walls falling down. I've been to Jericho. There is a layer in which there's a burn layer, but it's not in the 12th or 11th century. So there's a history of a burning and a collapse there. So you have to figure out how you put those things together. And I started thinking, I grew up thinking of the Bible as being like the Pope, and there were no errors in it, but instead I needed to think of the Bible as something that pointed to something more significant. But at the same time, that it reflected people's understanding, their interactions with who God was and who Jesus was. And sometimes they got it wrong. I mean, I think, when you run into the passages where God tells people to murder everybody there, the women, the children, all this sort of stuff, I think it's perfectly fine, and you've probably heard me teach this, it's perfectly fine to be offended by that and to say I don't think that's okay. But that's based frequently on using Bible to interpret Bible. The fundamental principles are to love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and to love your neighbors yourself. And that certainly doesn't sound like the latter of those two.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
I'd like to address the phrase where he talks about the lost sheep of the house of Israel.
Yeah.
In Isaiah,
But before you do that,
Yeah.
I should say, that's what he says in his life, but he dies, is resurrected, and then you get the Great Commission, which says, I went to the people, I tried to communicate my message to them, and it didn't happen, so now go to everybody. And so he says, go out to everybody at this point. So it changes at that time, but the community that he's addressing is still a Jewish Christian community that he's addressing. But go ahead.
yeah, in Isaiah tells the children of Israel that their ancestry, who their tribe was, became more important than he, and Isaiah tells them, I will disperse you. And during the time between Assyria and Babylon,
Right.
they were relocated to Assyria. But in the Bible it says by the river Gozan. Well, the river Kwazalozan is still there today, so we know where they were. So they dispersed through the Caucasus Mountains into Eastern Europe. And there was a group of people from Central Asia called, I forget what they were called, but their king thought this religion was an excellent way to control his people, so he adopted it. And those Jewish people are called the Ashkenazim today.
Right.
The other Jewish people that immigrated through Spain are the Sephardim, and they don't get along.
Back to what you said. I'm a big proponent of adult forum and adult education, because I think for many of us that our adult education stopped in 9th or 10th grade, and that education is not sufficient to deal with the problems you're going to encounter in life. If you're 33 and get leukemia and you're trying to figure out what's going on, God, and then you get cards from people saying that God's not going to give you anything that's too heavy for you to bear, there's nothing in your education that's going to help you deal with that. But I think, once again, frequently when you run into passages like that, you need to drop back to Matthew 22, 23 and say, well, how should I be interpreting what the Bible has to say about something like that? And how do I go back to the golden rule and to the 2 great commandments, and how did they tell me how to understand these situations? But I don't think I think what you get then is adequate for you as a 15-year-old, but it's not adequate for you as a 50-year-old. So, anything else? Go ahead.
Yeah, the books that were discovered in 1945 in Egypt, the community that
Nag Hammadi.
studied it, yeah. Do you think that Matthew was concerned with their beliefs too?
So the people at Nag Hammadi, very interested in the Gospel of John. And we'll talk about that. And interpreting John, using John, John is very popular with the Gnostics. And right there, that is actually probably a group of monks, and they have a monastery nearby. And in 365, Athanasius says, these are the only 27 books you're allowed to use in the Bible. And so it looks like they took all of their non-canonical stuff, some of it wonderful, some of it interesting, some of it inexplicable and hard to understand, and they buried it. And I think they believed they would go back and get it, and they never did. And so what's the name of the guy who discovers it?
I don't recall.
Muhammad Ali.
Muhammad Ali.
He's out looking for fertilizer and hits the thing, and he gets this pot, and it sounds like something's in there, and it gets cold one night. So his mom takes the vase and goes bam and smashes it. Just they're very upset because they thought it was gold that was in it. And she takes several of the documents, throws them in the fire to warm up the people, and those are gone forever. But there's still close to 20 documents still there.
Archaeologically, I think it would be an excellent class, though.
On Nag Hammadi? Yeah, I'm slowly working through this. I told you, you guys asked, when I did Paul, you asked for Jesus, so I'm putting it all on you. And then I'm going to do, Pastor wants me to do a thing on the creed. It's the anniversary of the creed, the Nicene Creed. I probably know as much as you do about the creed, so I gotta, over the summer, read a whole lot. So anything else? So again, look at those sheets of paper, see which ones appeal to you. I mean, you can leave them here if you want to. I'm gonna bring them back again and stuff, but if there is somebody you say, oh, this particular person looks very interesting, or I'd like to hear, and you don't have to agree with them. I don't think there was any scholar in the academy who agreed with Reza Aslan's book on that Jesus was a zealot, but he points out several verses that are weird. And like when they're in the Garden of Gethsemane and the soldiers come, well, first, that story is weird in different ways. In Mark, all of the people fall down and they arrest them. In John, Jesus stands up and all the soldiers fall down, and he tells them, get up, you gotta arrest me, get to it. But the interesting thing is, one of his disciples pulls out a sword. Where did that come from? And then there's another time when he tells them, when you're out traveling, I want you to take this, and a sword with you. So why is he telling them these things? And the bizarre thing is, there are some people who read the Bible and believe that's a justification for gun rights. Another one I'll talk to you about next time. Have you seen this attack on empathy? There are a couple books out saying empathy is a toxic emotion and that we shouldn't have it. This is something that's going around and becoming very popular with some people. There are two pastors who've written separate books arguing that empathy is toxic and we should avoid having any empathy for others. So, and these are Christians citing verses in the Bible to justify. And when you see that, take these passages I mentioned to you and say, how does this match up with what Jesus said in this section, what he said here, and what he said here? So, okay, you're free to go.
Thank you, Jim.